That's Maxi Priest and Wild World. 25 minutes past 10 is the time, and I welcome now to the studio Tony Butler, who's just very recently returned from South Africa, in fact a matter of days ago, is that not
That's
so?
right, yes.
You went over there really with a fairly open mind. Can I ask you why you went over there in the first place?
Well, I was invited by a friend of mine who's been living there for 15 years. He's in business in Johannesburg, and he invited me to go over and have a holiday visiting him for a couple of weeks. I was very much in two minds about it. I thought, go on a holiday in South Africa. But after thinking it over and talking to a few people, I thought, well, I'll go, but I will go with an open mind, with my eyes open, and I'll see as much as I can of the country and meet as many people as I can while I'm there. And it was a shattering experience for me.
In what way?
Well, we read about apartheid and reading the Guardian newspaper and all the sort of reports that one gets through on the media in England. But it isn't until you actually go there to see what's happening and meet people and feel the atmosphere of the place that really the reality of this comes through. And I was really very surprised by the things I learned. I started reading about really only 10 days because I was doing other things before I went there, and I read a couple of books, and I went to see the Biko film, and indeed bought then a book of Steve Biko's writings and sort of read the sort of thing he was saying, and I began to realise things that I hadn't realised before. For instance, that Biko and Nelson Mandela and people are university people. They have high qualifications, they write highly intelligently, that the ANC is an organisation which has been going since 1912, so that we're not talking about a sort of ground movement from people who have always been oppressed. We're talking about political movements from people who have a lot of intelligence and a lot of history backing them in what they're trying to do.
All right. Let's refer really to the situation as you found it, because you stayed in, Johannesburg?
Yes, I stayed in Johannesburg, and then we took a trip down to Durban, down to the east coast, the Indian Ocean coast, for a weekend. But I was mainly in Johannesburg. Johannesburg is an extraordinary city. I mean, it's an enormous modern city with skyscrapers, a lot of new office blocks. One of the things that amazed me was the money that corporations and businesses have there. And so the first impression of Johannesburg is this stunning new city with these enormous skyscraper blocks and some very interesting modern architecture. But at the same time, it's a city without a soul, really. It's all like Oxford Street or bits of the City of London. There are very few parks. Okay, there are grand buildings. There's a lot of open space around about the railway station and so on. But it's not a comfortable city at all. And again, the first thing, what I noticed driving in from the airport, and again, over and over again, all the time in the city, is the number of people who are just wandering around. So that as you drive on country roads in from the airport, or you drive around Johannesburg itself, you see black people everywhere. There are black people waiting by the side of the road. There are black people walking. And the first thing I said to my friend as we were driving in from the airport was, what are these people doing by the side of the road? Now, I don't think he could see them in a sense. Because they're always there, people in South Africa don't notice, but perhaps they're unemployed people just sitting. Perhaps they're unemployed people who are waiting for a lift somewhere where there might be a job, or they're people who are going into town to walk around, or some of them are there actually waiting for a bus or waiting for a trip to travel somewhere.
One knows of the attitude of the official line, as it were, to apartheid, to the black people from the white government. What about the people in the street that you met, the whites? How did they actually feel about what's going on there?
Yes, I didn't. I don't suppose I met many white people in the street, as it were, but the people I stayed with, I didn't meet any Afrikaans people. And one thing that I realised, which I hadn't perhaps taken in before, was that, for instance, the ruling National Party, which has a vast majority of seats in Parliament, I don't think there's a single English-speaking member of that governing party now. There used to be a few, but now they are all Afrikaans. So that this is, in a sense, a foreign country with a foreign government. These are Afrikaans-speaking people in government, and their attitude is what makes the laws. Now, as opposed to that, you've got a smaller number of English-speaking whites in South Africa who all the ones I met tend to be, and some of them, although they were English-speaking, were in fact of German stock or Swiss origin. They tend to be very much liberal. They tend to say, well, of course we want reform and all that. But in order to live there with what is going on out of sight and what we all know is going on behind the mirrors on the windows of the police station and so on, it is so horrific that the only possible way to survive is to push it out of sight and sort of talk about it, but, you know, not really face up to it, I'm afraid. And one has to understand they have their money there, they have their families there. So it is very difficult for English-speaking white people living there. But they tend to be liberal, and when it comes to talking politics, I mean, I never had to say, what about this, or what about apartheid? Because just by having ordinary conversation, politics comes into it the whole time. And it was never necessary for me to introduce criticism of the government, because everybody I met, within 5 minutes, they were telling me their criticism of the government.
And what were the sort of things they were saying?
Well, it is absolutely appalling. You know, the Group Areas Act, the education situation, the way that the blacks are kept out of sight, the situations in the townships. You see, one thing that I didn't know anything about before is this Group Areas Act, which means that black people are not allowed to live except in areas designated for black people. So that in Johannesburg, although, as I say, you see lots of black people walking around the streets, and there are lots of people now integrated into businesses. So if you go into almost any big corporation office and so on in Johannesburg, you will find black people on equal terms with white people. And I went into one such building, a very rich organization there, and there are not just black secretaries, as there are white secretaries, but I met, for instance, a black architect who's working with the other architects in that organization. But at night, he has to go back to Soweto to live. He can't live nearer than that. And Soweto is 12 miles outside Johannesburg. And you see the black buses going there. There's a black taxi organization which runs people in and out. And really very... And you know, the blacks that one sees, both in Soweto and around the streets, most of them are extremely well-dressed. And they look very smart, and they are extremely well-spoken. So if you speak to an ordinary black person in the street, you know, you will be able to speak very intelligently, very straightforwardly in English. That's in Johannesburg. It's not, they don't speak English in many other parts. But whereas we see this equality, as it were, inside the office block, in fact, that black architect has to go down and catch a black bus or drive his car back to Soweto and stay there and live in the township.
So I thought that segregation, in fact, on buses was a thing of the past.
Well, so did I. And at first I thought, well, maybe this isn't really an issue, because after all, the black people who are going back to the township, they're getting onto a bus, they're coloured blue, and you recognise them because they've got wire netting over the driver's window, which is, you know, protection against having stones thrown at them, being involved in a riot situation. And I thought, well, the black people are going back to the township in that bus, so that's a black bus. The white people are going shopping, so that the two don't really want to be on the same bus anyway. But then, of course, internally in Johannesburg, I was trying to get, say, to Wits University and down to the Market Theatre and to visit people. So I wanted to travel around on my own, so I wanted to travel in a bus. Now, most of the white people I asked didn't know where the buses went. So I had to ask black people to say, how can I catch a bus? Which number bus do I go to get somewhere? And one day when I did this, the first bus that came along got the wrong number on it. So and we all got off again, having got on. And that was a mixed bus. There were obviously black and white people on there. Then when we got off, I said rather loudly to anybody who would listen, oh, well, that's why I've been told I can't get round Johannesburg on the bus, because nobody quite knows where they're going and they've all got the wrong numbers on. So a white woman who was standing there said, oh, that's not true at all. It's a very efficient system. It's just that one happened to have got the wrong number on. And then she walked away, and I said to a black man who was standing there, a sort of office worker in a white shirt and a tie, I need to get down to Commissioner Street. Perhaps you could tell me if the right bus comes. Well, he said, I'm going that way as well. I'll come with you. But, he said, when the bus comes, it might be I'm not allowed on it. So, like you said, Mark, I thought, well, I thought this was a thing of the past, where he said it depends on the driver. So when this bus came, the first thing was I said to him, if this was London, I said, I'd make a scene. I don't mind having arguments in the street and all that, but maybe that isn't wise to do in Johannesburg. Oh, that's all right, he said, if you feel strongly about something, why don't you speak out about it? So I said, okay. And then the bus arrived, and I said, you go on first, and if you're not allowed on, then I'll make a protest. And he seemed to be agreeing to that, so on he went. And I noticed that just behind the driver, through the driver's window, there was a chap standing with a pale blue flat hat on, who, whether he'd overheard me before, I don't know, but he'd come round to the driver's side. When the black man got there, the driver shook his head and wouldn't look at him. And so he turned round to come away, and I could see this blue-hatted chap through the window. So then I, standing a bit behind, I said, why can't this man come on this bus? And the driver sort of shrugged. It was one of these driver pay people, a one-man bus. But there was only one entrance, so the people come on and go off through the same door. So where I was standing, I was in fact preventing people coming off as well as people going on. And I just stood there and I said, well, I thought all that was a thing of the past, it's ridiculous. Why can't this man travel on this bus? So the driver wouldn't get into any conversation, but he just sort of shrugged his shoulders. And there were other people coming on, including a couple of black women who were just behind me. And they turned away and the black man got off. So then I stepped off and the bus went on its way with its white-only passengers. Well, now this blue-capped chap I'd seen talking to the driver was then standing a little bit away from me, sort of 4 or 5 yards away, not attempting to come towards me, but obviously standing there so that I could go to him. So I thought, right, well, let's have this out. So I went to him and I said, I thought that all that was a thing of the past, segregation on the buses in South Africa. Why weren't these people allowed on the bus? He said, it's the government ruling. We have to have 2 bus routes in Johannesburg, which is for whites only. So I said, well, why is that? I don't know why that is. He said, well, of course, it's nothing to do with us. It's the government which would do it. And he was perfectly friendly. And somebody suggested to me afterwards that, in fact, this was his job, perhaps, to calm things down if there was any sort of incident like this. When the next bus came, which was going exactly the same place, then the same thing, the black man got on first, and this time he was allowed on. And the driver of that, who was, I think, coloured, he didn't, though it's very hard to tell by looking at people, because, as you know, race is defined in South Africa according to sort of legal documents rather than what anybody looks like. And he was allowed on, and he actually said, as we came on, well, why doesn't everybody allow, they've all got good money, so let everybody onto any bus. That was what the driver of this next bus said. And I don't know quite how he'd known, whether somebody told him as they got on what had happened. I then got on and sat in front of the black man I'd been talking to, and a younger friend of his sat beside him, and the 2 black women were sitting across the gangway from us. So I said, we were laughing about it, really, and certainly the 2 girls opposite were looking, quite excited by the prospect. I think that it doesn't often happen. Everybody tends to accept all these things. So I'd rather enjoyed this, actually, and we were all smiling. But I turned and I said to him, it isn't really funny, is it? Don't you feel angry about this? And he said, well, not really. I mean, that's the way it is. I accept it. I just put up with it and get on with my life. But the chap next to him said, yes, I feel angry. He was younger. And then his friend said, well, he's going to be late for his appointment. But this wasn't the real reason. Of course, they do feel angry, and the amazing thing is that it doesn't show itself more often, because to be pushed around as not being on a level with white people is obviously very humiliating. And
You were actually there during one of the stayaways, weren't you?
Yes. That was the last 3 days I was there. There was a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday stayaway, which one of the interesting things there is the reaction of the people who are running the companies, the offices and the internationals and so on, because if they're being broad-minded, like, for instance, the office block where I met that black architect, they would say to their people, well, of course, we don't want you to get into trouble in the township, but we do want you to come into the office. And so, if you stay away for the day, you're going to lose a day's pay. Now, so what happens is that people like him come in, they put on their jeans instead of putting on their suit, and they leave the township quite early in the morning, and they come into Johannesburg, and they come to the office early, and then soon after lunchtime, they go back out of the office, and they go back to the township. And so they're seen walking around, not in their business clothes, and they're there in the afternoon, and they say, well, they've just been in shopping or something, but in fact they go in to do their job because they want to fulfill their job and not cause trouble at that end. So that's but you see, what happens, of course, is that there can be the militant people in the townships who actually set up roadblocks in order to stop blacks coming in on these stay-away days, who might well attack their houses, and we've heard about the horrific things that can happen in the way of beatings up and the necklace killings and so on, when the black people feel they're being betrayed. And so there is a tremendous movement to try and get everybody to stay away like that, if there is such a stay away. For instance, some time ago, I was told when I visited Soweto by the priest who took me around there was a time when there was there are very few shops in Soweto, so that the black people living there have to get into Johannesburg to do their shopping and then carry it back. So there was a boycott on white shops. This is 2 or 3 years ago, I think now. And a youth movement in Soweto who were being very brutal about waiting at all the places where the buses were coming back from Soweto, and anybody who came off the bus with a shopping bag was, the bags were opened and the things were taken out, and people treated very brutally, so that there was it said there was a woman who was made to drink an entire can of paraffin, which she had bought in Johannesburg that day. And real violence and harassment among the black people who are trying to prevent anybody from breaking the solid front when they are making a protest against the whites. And in fact, I'm told that food boycott did last sort of 3 days or something, and the shops in Johannesburg did feel the difference. And there are now a few more shops in Soweto, but the government's very powerful, you see. The police, the army are around, can appear very, very quickly, and are tremendously powerful and forceful and have all the guns and everything, so that the chances of any protest really getting momentum, unless it was a full-scale riot, in which case hundreds of people would get killed. I mean, the whole thing is kept down the whole time, the force of keeping things as they are.
I mean, obviously, anything that we see or indeed hear of in this country nowadays is subject to South African censorship.
Yes, and indeed in South Africa itself. There's some ways in which we know more. For instance, June the 16th, which is the anniversary of the Soweto riots and the first terrible killings there, it was the date when the state of emergency ended on June the 16th, and a new state of emergency had to be declared. Now, when I said to people in Johannesburg, the white people I was staying with, the people that I met, oh, I won't still be here on June the 16th. They said, what's June the 16th? Well, they knew it was the anniversary of the Soweto thing. But they didn't know that the state of emergency was due to be confirmed or lifted at that point. Now, we knew that in England, and I was telling them that. Very interestingly, one of the things which is not censored is anything that happens in Parliament. And one of the pieces that was in the Johannesburg Star was about a member of Parliament who had visited a township outside Bloemfontein and was trying to get improvement to the roads there and to meet local leaders, and he was saying how little electricity there was, the condition of the roads, the fact that it was out of the sort of 93 kilometres of road inside the township, there was only 7 kilometres which was paved, tarmacked, and that it had been raining the day that he got there, so that people couldn't get to him because they were stuck in the mud, and that there are these people living in these slum conditions, and the government is saying one thing, but the reality is another thing. Now, that was reported in the Johannesburg Star because it had come up in Parliament. But there are lots and lots of things which are not, including, I guess, bomb blasts and murders and activities both by the police and possibly by people who are trying to disrupt the government, which it has not reported.
Right. We're going to take a break right now, Tony, and the time now, quarter. That's DC Lee and See the Day, and the time is 10 minutes to 11. Now, well, you did actually visit Soweto. You've come back, in fact, with a paper called the Sowetan, which is the black paper, isn't it?
Yes. The Sowetan's on sale in Johannesburg. Most of the English language papers could be called liberal papers. The Afrikaans papers are pro-government ones. So there's one English paper printed by the government called The Citizen. But actually to visit Soweto is not difficult. There are bus tours to Soweto. And also, if one can meet somebody living there, and indeed, as every black lives in a township, there's Alexandra Township, there are one or two others near Johannesburg, but Soweto is the big one, then in fact, by getting to know a black person, one could take a trip to Soweto and visit them. I was taken by an English priest, somebody who works on a centre just outside Johannesburg, a piece of land which belongs to the church, where they have a conference centre and continual conflict with the government, but where they do manage to keep going. And having visited him there, he then suggested that I go with him to a church in Soweto on the Sunday. And that was a wonderful experience, because Christianity really makes sense there. You know, the lessons from the Old Testament, the Psalms, which are about oppressed people and about believing that God stands up for righteousness and justice, you really hear them when you're in that setting. It's amazing to be there. The singing is wonderful. The church, which had been built by the people in Soweto, a fairly new building, with its own conference centre there, entirely run by black people there. And in terms of the black groups really pulling themselves up by their shoestrings and getting things done, showing their competence, learning about administration, learning about economics and running things, the churches have played a tremendous role in South Africa. So that this church, this congregation, which started with the help of the white priest who took me, is now entirely run by black people.
And when you met with black people, was there any resentment of the whites, or the fact that you were white?
Not in the people that I spoke to at all. In the street, when you pass black people or buy a newspaper or go into a shop, sometimes I felt, well, they should be resenting me, but then one can't tell because, they don't obviously burst out with this. The servants in people's houses, again, seem to be very friendly, and you have servants who say things like, well, I like this government, I don't want blacks running this country, or, we're very happy as we are. In Soweto, meeting people in that church, the fact that I'd gone to that church, and at the same day that I went there was a group of people from California visiting, about half a dozen of them who'd also come to the church. And so they felt supported in their enterprise by us as white visitors. So obviously, as it were, we were the goodies, so that they were okay to us. And I didn't feel any of that. I did feel right down in the Zulu territory, where I travelled with my friends, where the people are very poor and don't speak English. I did feel there that I felt very uncomfortable. I felt we're being intruders, we're being tourists, we're not liked here at all.
Right. Can I come back to you? One thing that we started talking about was the ANC, because you mentioned that it had been formed, in fact, in 1912 as
That's
an
right.
organisation. There are two faces, of course, of the ANC, and indeed, from the paper here, I see June the 7th, this is the Johannesburg Star, I think it is, one of the English-speaking liberal papers.
Right.
For instance, the headline here, ANC plans to increase bomb attacks in an attempt to rise sagging black morale and undermine whites' faith in the government's ability to protect them. I mean, obviously there is that face of the ANC, and there's a good...
You notice also in that article, it actually says in the body of that article, something like, we can't actually say all the things that were said at this conference because we're not allowed to print them. So they're allowed to print the bit of the conference which talks about, and there will be a stepping up of terrorist activity, but they're not allowed to print the bit which says the main aim of the ANC is to promote understanding.
Yeah, well, this is actually, it says, Mr. Tambo outlined the ANC's official policy on bomb attacks, etc. The Star may not report what he said.
That's right, that's right. So his official policy on bomb attacks was that although he understands that there are some members, we've heard Oliver Tambo saying this on British media in the last week, that although they understand that there are some members of the ANC who are going to follow this path, the leadership doesn't want it. But you see, what are you going to do against violent oppression? And we're talking about people being dragged off. I mean, anybody, a white person, can be arrested by any policeman in the street for no stated reason and disappear and never be seen again. There is no right of having to know. I was warned this by my friends. Nobody, no relative can go and say, I must find, or can get a lawyer. There's no habeas corpus in South Africa. So they are living in as a police state, which is a violent study, where violence is being perpetrated against the black people. So what is the answer to this? The amazing thing is not only the Pacific policy of the ANC, who want to negotiate in this, but in fact the amazing forgiving attitude and the tremendous warmth that comes from the black people, certainly the black people that I met in South Africa. And the terrible tragedy to me, as much as anything else, is the fact that these people are being prevented from contributing to the society in South Africa when they have so much to contribute, because certainly all the black people, most of the black people I met, were tremendously warm-hearted and generous people. So the ANC, which has been going since 1912, has a tremendous history of intellectual, philosophical, political discussion and training people, having to take people out of South Africa, sending them abroad for further education purposes and paying for them and that sort of thing. In other words, in order to build up the intelligent black man who's going to be a contribution to society, also, understandably, feels very angry, and people try and do things to show up this against the government.
You recoiled when you picked up the phone once and the black voice at the other end called you master.
Yes, I was alone in the house and answered the phone, and it was somebody who wanted to speak to the black maid, and I said that she was out, and so the voice said, thank you, master, and I thought, this can't be right, it was taking me to a different world, which it is a different world. It's a world in which black people call white people master or boss, and it varies from place to place. Johannesburg, you see, actually is as it were, the most liberal in some places. There's even a part of Johannesburg called Hillbrow where, in fact, people of all races are living because the whites have moved out, because in the last 3 or 4 years, Johannesburg has become a more violent place, and the landlords are quietly letting flats to people of any colour, and so the greying of Johannesburg is now an accepted fact.
There are areas, of course, for instance, governed by, not governed so much, but by influenced by Terre Blanche and his very radical party.
Yes, they're the very right-wing people who think that the Botha government is in fact being much too liberal and is loosening up on things. These people are in the true heritage of the Boer, the Voortrekker movement and so on, the people who moved away from the English down in the Cape in the early part of the 19th century and travelled north to find new territory, and they fought against the Zulus. In 1838, that's 150 years ago, was the battle at Blood River, which was the final defeat of the Zulus. And the actual monument at Blood River, which is a circle of ox wagons made of bronze, life-size, 200 yards across. They've actually built this laager from which they defended against the Zulus, and it's there in the middle of nowhere, these bronze wagons. And outside Pretoria there is this enormous Voortrekker monument, which is a sort of Wagnerian fantasy, an enormous building with an altar in the bottom where on the 16th of December, which is the anniversary of the Blood River battle, the sunlight comes through a tiny hole in the concrete dome way up above and strikes the centre of the altar at noon on the 16th of December, which is a sort of their patriotic moment. And all this is it's very understandable. Here are people who fought their way against the British, against the Zulus, to claim this country, and they want it for theirs. And their opinion is that black people are just subhuman beings, and they're going to keep them there.
Tony, there's lots of other things to talk about. We've run out of time, I'm afraid. Things like the Sharpeville Six. We took Nelson Mandela still in prison. But in the final analysis, having been there once and having found it so, you called it another world, would you go back? Are you going back?
I would be interested to go back to, as it were, see more people and meet more people and attempt. You see, I met 2 priests, one black, one white, who had been in prison, both of them out and about now, one of them still on trial and on bail from a trial. And the whole thing that is going on there is, it does need people who who know about it, and as you say, there's a tremendous movement in this country, Nelson Mandela's birthday and so on, and the big rally on July the 17th or 18th run by the anti-apartheid movement. It's wonderful, isn't it, that the anti-apartheid movement actually live in Mandela Street, London, NW1. It's not often that we rename streets politically in this country, but I think it's a great gesture that England has managed to rename one street with that name.
It's been a fascinating conversation. Tony Butler, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thanks, Mark.
Incidentally, those who would like to know more about the anti-apartheid movement can contact them in Mandela Street, presumably.
Yes, 13 Mandela Street, London NW1, and their phone number is 01387 7966.
Tony Butler, thank you for joining me. And the time now is 11 o'clock.
This is BBC Radio Oxford.